So I'm with Alan Collins, first time for a long time, due to circumstances which we all know about. But you must be coming towards the end of your current inquiries, wasn't you?
I don't know. It's good to be back after all this time. I think it's 6-7 months since I was last here. So it's been a busy old time here again, investigating various matters concerning, I think, access to justice. And I think that's probably one of the issues that you want to talk to me about.
Well, strangely enough, the Law Society put out a thing today on Twitter, I think it was, and it was a statement about lawyers not being intimidated, about still being able to fight their corner. I think they're mostly talking about immigration cases, but I thought it was rather unusual. I presume it was a genuine document. Law Society telling, they had some documentaries come out, and they were not pleased that the suggestion that lawyers could be intimidated not to fight somebody's corner for them.
Well, I think if lawyers upset governments, then it might be that lawyers are actually doing a good job. So if governments don't like lawyers for whatever reason, it's probably because the lawyers are getting in the way, that they're trying to defend people's rights and liberties. And people's rights and liberties sometimes get taken for granted by all comers.
One of the effects of the child inquiry here was that the Convention on the Rights of the Child was signed up for Jersey, and there now is going to be a trip to Geneva with the Children's Commissioner and others. Of course, there's a very great shortage of NGOs in Jersey, but a group of children are going. They're all off to Geneva to respond to the report which the United Nations has done, which I don't know the terms of reference exactly, but it's about how well is Jersey doing. Do you know about that? Will you be participating?
No, I've heard all about it today, and I'll be very interested in reading up on it.
Yeah, she's going to publish her report on her website, the Children's Commissioner, but presumably people will be going from all over Great Britain for their different patches, presumably.
Well, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is, at all levels, I guess, a very worthy document, and governments all around the world have signed up to it. But that doesn't mean to say that it becomes part of law. So dealing with the UK, for example, parliamentary select committees, I think more than once, have recommended to the then UK government that the convention should be actually part of UK law.
Like the European Convention is, more or less.
That's right. So the sort of riposte that you get is, well, we don't need to do that because the courts will take notice of it, and so on. But that's not right. That's law is law, and this idea that you can just say, oh yes, we've signed up to it and we'll take notice of it and so on, doesn't add up to a row of beans when it comes to realities. If somebody's rights have been trampled on in one way or another, they need to be in a position to do something about it. And if they're looking to the convention as a vehicle to challenge the government over whatever the issue happens to be, the convention needs to be part of the law, otherwise you can't really use it.
It can be persuasive, I presume.
What does that mean?
I know.
So that's why Sweden, I think, Sweden, it is Sweden, I think it's Sweden a couple of months ago, have actually recognised the reality, and Sweden has actually done something about it and said, right, the convention is now part of our law. Well, we're not just going to pay lip service to it or say, oh, well, it's persuasive, whatever that means.
Right, that's right.
They've actually said it's actually part of the law. And as someone who sees things when they all go wrong, the convention is an opportunity to make sure things don't go wrong. And that's what it must be all about, is in everybody's interest.
Have you any evidence so far that either in the UK or in Jersey that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is having any effect?
You have to look at it in reverse. The reverse side is that there are arguably considerable gaps in child protection. And if the convention was part of the law, then governments would have to fill in the sizable gaps in law on child protection. So if you take, for example, mandatory reporting. So mandatory reporting is all about someone having a suspicion that a child is being abused or at risk of abusing, being compelled to report that concern to the police. At the moment, the individual, by and large, can sort of shrug their shoulders, nothing to do with me, and so on. So there's considerable arguments as to why there should be mandatory reporting. So, an adult is concerned about a child's welfare, thinks the child is at risk of being abused or is being abused. Not only should they be under a moral obligation to do something about it by telling the police, they should be under a legal obligation to
But
do
there
it.
are the cynics like me. I'm a great enthusiast for international conventions because it gives an outside. But the European Convention for Human Rights includes things against inhuman and degrading treatment. So it has things. It has protection of the family life in the home. There are clauses in there which equally apply to children and I've never heard them in Jersey, certainly never heard them quoted, saying, well, you're being abused at home, therefore that is a convention right.
But children are not empowered, are they? Children are dependent on adults taking up the cudgels for them. So, as I said, children are dependent on adults, and there's quite a lot of excellent research, for example, that came out of the Royal Commission in Australia, where children were found to be heard but not listened to. And so children, say in the in England, for example, under the Children Act 1989, in some particular circumstances, can, in theory, make their own applications to a judge. Fine in theory, but in reality they are too dependent on adults. The dynamic's wrong. And I think it's because we ask the wrong questions. We're looking all the time about sort of new laws, new policies and so on, but we're looking at it through the lens of the adult eyes, whereas we should be looking at it, as best as we can, through the lenses of the children.
I mean, I was trying a strange thing the other day. I was looking through 18th century history, and there was a reference there to children being represented in some case or other. And it was all about their friend, a friend to represent them in court. Now, obviously, that is some sort of a long-standing principle,
yes,
isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know who appointed them in the 18th.
You can have a court-appointed guardian,
right.
So yes, but it's done through the eyes of an adult, and maybe that's can't be divorced from reality. But the convention, which is what we were started to talk about, gives an opportunity for policy and law to be viewed and developed differently,
Right.
by thinking about, well, how does this actually empower children? Because it's about accountability at the end of the day. Children get let down by adults, and sometimes in the most extreme and terrible ways. And maybe if children were given the opportunity to hold wrongdoers and failures and authorities and departments to account.
I find it very puzzling, I must say, because there is in the determination of their civil rights and obligations, human rights, European Convention, it's there. How can Jersey lawyers or any lawyers be ignoring it over the years? If they're dealing with children, matters which affect children,
It's because
how can they ignore it?
Well, it's because, as I said, I just offer the thought that perhaps we're asking the wrong questions all the time. We should be asking the question, how is it that we can bring about accountability for children? How can we empower children? Not about empowering adults to have more power when it comes to children. It's about actually empowering children.
But
Yes,
you-
they are.
I
yes,
keep asking this.
yes.
Why are you aware of it and not other lawyers?
Well, maybe they are, but anyway, you're the one. You're interviewing me, so I can only speak for me.
But
I'm saying, you've got this interesting opportunity coming up in Geneva, and So I'm going to be reading up on all of that. Sounds fascinating. I just hope that that opportunity
Well-
is used to think, well, okay,
Would the Jersey Law Society be making a representation? Would they be making a report? Would they? I mean, that's the sort of body that should.
go and ask them.
Yeah.
But it's an opportunity, I think, for the question that I'm asking, which is well, okay, how can the convention be seen as an opportunity? If the convention was incorporated into Jersey law, what kind of opportunity does that present?
Just sidetrack very slightly. You've been dealing in the last couple of years since you raised the matter about Le Chesne, and that we've just seen in the JP or somewhere reported this week about the amount of compensation that's been paid out for people, cases under that, and they were surprised it wasn't as much as they thought it was going to be. Now, presumably, they've had to have a basis on which. Why are they paying out at all? Have they looked at human rights obligations and said, "Oh, we've been breaking somebody's human rights"? Has that been?
Well, that was if I recall correctly. If I go back a couple of years, I think that was one of the arguments that I deployed.
Indeed, it was
At the care inquiry about when all this information started to come out about children being held at Le Chesne and the use of secure unit and so on, and what was going on there.
But they didn't pick up on it, did they? Has it been a discussion point when you're negotiating and you're whatever?
Well, let's put it this way. The scheme doesn't require those kinds of arguments. So under the scheme, a person qualifies or they don't. It's quite sort of fact dependent. You know, if someone either meets the criteria for a payment or they don't. So the opportunity to have arguments about whether the law was broken or not broken, or as the case may be, is this sort of has gone. Those arguments were sort of.
But it wasn't only, as you explained a couple of years ago, it wasn't only Le Chesne. This was a fairly wide-ranging, locking children away in all sorts of circumstances, without them having any resort to a tribunal how are they getting on?
Which brings you back to the opportunity that the convention might bring if it is incorporated into Jersey law. And, you know, it's an ideal opportunity to ask that question and think seriously about the answers. It's not just oh, here we are, another convention. That's looking at it the wrong way. It's looking to see, well, okay, why is there this convention in the first place? Why are there these various paragraphs and articles about children's rights? Why are they there? They're there for a reason, and it's because, as we know, whether we like it or not, children all around the world are exploited and abused.
Well, it's part of a whole range of interlinked conventions and obligations. You can't have really the one without the other. If you're going to be specific about children need their own, well, if the European Convention doesn't cover everybody, which it should do.
Well, the European Convention, is applicable, but it's, obviously. But what I'm looking at, given your questions and in the context of where you're coming from, is if the convention was actually incorporated into law, what kind of opportunity does that bring to improve the lot of Jersey society? Because
there was a case in point, the Convention for the Prevention of Discrimination Against Women. Now, I understand that was about to be signed for Jersey before the lockdown, and it's been put off. But even the UK, under that, you see, there was a clause, as I understand it, which would allow women to make petitions, and it was taken out. I think it was taken out, so that it couldn't be enacted. So they wanted it ineffective. They didn't want people going off and complaining. Yeah. So it makes you wonder about what governments are really about, doesn't it?
Well, of course, governments don't like to be challenged. It's a fact of life, isn't it? And in another context, there's quite a powerful argument when it comes to the UN and
well, it's the Council of Europe. It's not just the UN, is it?
No, so in another sort of area, but related area, there's an argument that if you're, there's UN conventions which cover people who are displaced. They're in a refugee camp. And there's these terrible reports of refugees being abused by peacekeepers.
Yeah.
Now, the refugees, on paper, have a right to do something about it if that terrible misfortune befalls them. But it's somewhat divorced from reality, because it's, in my opinion, because you can't expect a refugee in some godforsaken camp to fill out some kind of form and post it to the UN in New York. You know, it's not going to happen. You know, if you're a refugee, you're living from hand to mouth, day to day. You know, you're worried about making sure you've got food and water and shelter. You're not going to be worrying about, oh yes, I've got to go and collect a form, fill out a form and detail, you know, my
Well, it's a
complaint.
dilemma for anybody who's poor or disabled, or I mean, it affects so many range of people. Access to the law, access to it.
That's right.
Justice, where you first.
So, you know, there's, you know, so, you know, the UN sort of says, well, you've got these rights, but it's looked at through the wrong end of the prism, so to speak. It's looked at from the policy makers as opposed to the people on the ground.
Right.
Yeah, you need to tune into one of my podcasts. I've spoken about this on one of my podcasts.
Okay,
Actually, you tune into my podcast.
Well, I do link.
I'm
them.
giving you a free
I do link-
podcast here,
okay.
aren't I?
Well, this is a free podcast.
So
well,
if you-
of course, the Great Jersey Human Rights Conference should have been taking place about
Yes.
now, but of course, it's had to be postponed. I hope
But
it
getting
gets-
back to the point, you know, what I've learned is that there's an opportunity to look at these issues from a completely different angle. Instead of looking at it from the high, lofty planes of, you know, lawyers and politicians and, oh yes, we've got this policy that does this, that and the other. Fine on paper, but it's a million miles away from the reality of the person that is
And yet
meant to assist.
in Jersey, as we know, we're not known to know the details. There were claims going in for hundreds of millions in one case, compensation where children have been mistreated. Now that was the sort of extreme end which frightened the system here, and obviously it's had all sorts of repercussions. They brought in a law so that such things were unlikely to happen in the same way again. But it just shows you, doesn't it? You've been representing people for Les Chênes particularly, and there's according to the reports, there's amounts of some for £1,000. I've no idea what those were rated at, and the maximum payout I think was £10,000 on those published. Nothing like £100 million, was it? You know, and this is where's all? How did some lawyers grab it? Obviously, there's money if it's 100 million, isn't it? The lawyer's going to get a fee.
Well, cases that run into seven-figure sums are, relatively speaking, very rare, and they're usually, and I don't know the details of the case that you're referring to, so don't misunderstand me.
Right.
So, but if a youngster has had something happen to him, maybe a medical accident or been sexually assaulted or whatever, and the physical and or psychiatric aspect has rendered them incapable of leading an independent life, then that has enormous financial implications for that person.
Well, that's what I
and,
was-
and maybe for the family. So
Yeah.
quite often in these cases, clinical negligence cases, where maybe a baby has been starved of oxygen
right.
at birth and has maybe a normal life expectancy, the care of looking after that youngster is going to be enormous. It's going to be beyond the reach of parents.
Absolutely. Well, obviously,
Yeah,
you're talking about lifetime care
Yeah,
of a
that's
very
right.
specialist sort,
Yeah,
all that sort of thing.
That's right, and you're paying for labour. You're
Yeah,
paying for
absolutely.
specialist
Exactly.
carers. And
I'm mindful
Yeah.
that we've got to get you to the airport.
thank you very much. You want to
And
escort me off the
Just
island?
tell me very briefly, you've been through, because that's an aspect of the human rights, the travel. Have you, on this trip, you've had to come through, presumably you've had to be tested.
I have indeed.
When you go back to England, will you be tested again?
I don't know. I was asked that a little while ago
Right.
when I telephoned home to say, yeah, I'm
Right.
packing up, I'm on my way home. And I was asked, oh, you're going to get tested at Heathrow?
Right,
I suspect not.
right.
So well, I was at Heathrow yesterday, coming back from somewhere else, and that was an internal domestic flight. I didn't see any testing there. So,
But again, these are all aspects. There are implications for human rights, and there will be cases. There are cases about free movement and all those sorts of aspects.
yeah, I think, regardless of the medical side of coronavirus and COVID-19, it's obviously affected all aspects of life, and many people have adapted and so on, but there'll be those who perhaps have been particularly vulnerable, who've had no choice in certain things that's happened to them. And one of those areas of considerable concern is child protection. You know, children may be left in situations where they should not have been left, and but time will tell.
We won't have time to deal with them today. When the Human Rights Conference gets back on, the Jersey Human Rights Conference put back on, you're one of the speakers, I hope. You were able to perform before, and I hope you'll come back with that. And over a period of days, I hope we can explore these sorts of issues, because they're never fully discussed in Jersey.
Well, if you tune into my podcasts, which are published every week on a Friday,
Right.
there's that opportunity. So you needn't deprive yourself.
Okay.
There's a podcast every week, and more often than not, there's a human rights angle.
I wish there were pictures. People like pictures with their books.
Wow. Imagine.